In the summer of 1989, the unthinkable happened. A James Bond movie, License to Kill, flopped at the US box office. While its box office failure was maybe a touch overblown, the fact is the movie still did very well internationally. It unfortunately spelled the end for Timothy Dalton as James Bond, even though a third film was in the planning stages for quite a long time afterwards. In fact, I remember Timothy Dalton even talking about a potential film while doing the press tour for The Rocketeer, in which he memorably played the villain. However, there were all kinds of legal problems that meant that the series just wasn't going to continue until they were settled. It had something to do with the sale of United Artists to Pathé CEO Giancarlo Peretti, who apparently sold off the library of James Bond films to television at a cut-rate price, leading to a lawsuit by Albert R. Broccoli's company. So, until that was settled, there was going to be no James Bond film, although they certainly did work on it a little bit on and off during the 90s with directors such as John Landis, Ted Kotcheff, John Byram, and most notably Alphonse Ruggiero Jr., hired to rewrite and possibly direct the films. Eventually, the Bond rights lawsuits was finally settled in December of 1992, so they could go ahead with another James Bond film. But was Timothy Dalton going to return? Here's where things get a little bit complicated. Everybody always says that Timothy Dalton was dismissed from the part. Dalton himself says he quit, and that seems to be the consensus from everybody involved at United Artists and Eon Films.
And then the movies were brought to a halt because of a lawsuit between the producers and the studio, which meant there was this huge 6-year gap. And then when that was cleared up, they told me they wanted me to do another, but, I felt I'd done it. Bond is a dominating image, and if I started again now, 6 years later, it'd maybe for the rest of my life.
Yeah. However, now with Timothy Dalton out, they had to go about finding a new James Bond, and there were certainly a lot of contenders that they looked at. Mel Gibson, Hugh Grant, and Liam Neeson were all offered the part, apparently, and passed on it. Pierce Brosnan, however, seemed to have something of an inside track. You see, Pierce Brosnan was the original choice when they did The Living Daylights, but he had to step down because he was starring in Remington Steele. His career had faltered a little bit in the years since, although he kind of seemed to be on the comeback trail with roles in The Lawnmower Man and Chris Columbus's Mrs. Doubtfire, and apparently it was Chris Columbus who heavily campaigned for him for the role. And Brosnan, I should say, has always been very loyal to Columbus afterwards, even showing up in Percy Jackson. So, Pierce Brosnan finally did play the part that he was always meant to play when he was signed in a very public press conference in June 1994 to finally play James Bond. However, they still had to get a script together, and a lot of writers had their fingerprints on this one. Michael France ended up with story credit, and the final screenplay was written by Jeffrey Kane and Bruce Firestein. Apparently, they had to scrap the original script at one point because it was too similar to True Lies. Now, if you look at the kinds of movies that were popular in the mid-90s, in terms of spy movies, the thing that was really hot at the time were the Tom Clancy films. Jack Ryan was the super spy that everybody was going to see these days. So, as was usual with a James Bond film, the next film would be patterned on what was popular at the moment. They always kind of followed trends, so Goldeneye is not unlike a Jack Ryan film in some ways. Now, I do have to say that this film was a major event back in the fall of 1995, which was a really exciting time to be a James Bond fan. You see, it had been 6 years since License to Kill hit theaters, and in that time, I discovered the Bond series. I loved Timothy Dalton and I loved Roger Moore, but I had never gone to see a Bond movie in theaters at this time. Pierce Brosnan was gonna be my guy, and I was so excited when he signed on to play the part. I remember watching the press conference when they finally announced that Pierce Brosnan was going to play James Bond and being tremendously excited. Flash forward to the summer of 1995, I remember vividly going to see Batman Forever in the theaters, and then finally the United Artists logo started at the beginning for the coming attractions, and I realized this was a James Bond trailer. It kind of has subtle undertones of the James Bond theme playing as Pierce Brosnan walks up to the screen and introduces himself as James Bond.
You were expecting someone else?
It was an amazing trailer, and I couldn't believe how cool this James Bond movie looked. Finally, it was going to be my first James Bond movie in theaters. Pierce Brosnan was going to be the James Bond of my era, and Goldeneye was a major, major event. I was in high school at the time. Everybody was talking about it, even kids, that didn't necessarily know about James Bond, but it looked amazing. Now, I have to say, Pierce Brosnan's run as James Bond, sadly, is very hit and miss. And it has to be said, Goldeneye, which is his first James Bond film, is by far his best James Bond film, which is a little bit disappointing because Brosnan was not lacking in talent. he was lacking in material. Now, unlike some of the later Pierce Brosnan Bond movies, which just went way over the top, Goldeneye is epic, but doesn't go too overboard in the action department, except for one really goofy scene at the beginning of the movie where Bond free falls into an airplane. I love the stunt where he does the bungee jump, but the free falling where he catches up with the plane was just really phony, and that early 90s CGI really doesn't do it any favors. That said, Martin Campbell, who was the guy who directed it, would go on to introduce Daniel Craig as James Bond in Casino Royale and really knew how to handle the action. He made Pierce Brosnan as James Bond just this immediate thing that clicked, and you have to give him credit. He did a great job with this movie. In the film, Bond must stop a group of terrorists led by his former friend and colleague Alec Trevelyan, aka 006.
Ready to save the world again? After you, 006.
Who threatened to use a Russian satellite weapons system codenamed Goldeneye on London. Now, Goldeneye, the title of the weapons system and the title of the film itself, comes from Ian Fleming's Jamaican writer's retreat, Goldeneye. The storyline to this film is fine. It's nothing terribly special. I could see Pierce Brosnan or Timothy Dalton both doing the same kind of premise, but it's just a shell really for James Bond to re-enter the fray. And I also like the fact that much is made of James Bond being a relic of the Cold War to his superiors.
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War.
It's also the first film to notably feature a female M, with Judi Dench in a part that she would make iconic. The fact that this role was going to be played by a woman was huge news in 1995, and I find it interesting to rewatch this film now, as Brosnan's dynamic with Dench is completely different from the one she shares with Daniel Craig. It's much chillier. In the Brosnan films, M, while she'll often critique his personal habits, is never on his case for being a loose cannon. You know that she feels deep down that he's smarter. You get the feeling that she knows deep down that Bond is always in control of the situation and knows what he's doing, but it's very much a boss-employee type relationship, whereas in the Daniel Craig Bond movies, M is almost like a surrogate mother to him, which gave, I think, Judi Dench a lot more to do than she gets to do in the Brosnan Bond films. But they're also too close in age to really make that dynamic work. There's more of an age gap between Dench and Craig, which is exploited to some degree and is very effective. M is also nowhere near as tough as she would be in the Daniel Craig films, where you'd see her out in the field a lot and really take an active role. Here she's always at MI6. She also has a really firm handle on what James Bond is doing in the Daniel Craig films, but in this one, Brosnan as Bond is kind of on his own and answers to no one. He's more like Sean Connery or Roger Moore or Timothy Dalton in that regard. The film itself is pretty interesting and is very well shot by Phil Mayhew, and Martin Campbell really did know how to make an epic Bond movie on a pretty modest budget, with it only costing $50 million, which was a lot less than action movies usually cost in that era. There were a lot of really good action scenes. Some of the CGI isn't great, but the stunt work is awesome. The only thing about this movie is I've always found the first act a little bit slow. It takes a while for the film to get going, but once it does, it's absolutely amazing, and I give this one a strong 8 on 10. Now let's run down some of the things that makes this James Bond movie a James Bond movie. And I have to say, in his first outing, Pierce Brosnan does a really good job. I mean, look at him. He's about 42, probably in his physical prime in this movie. His hair was amazing. He was super fit, and Brosnan seemed to be having the time of his life. I always thought he was probably a lot more like Roger Moore than Sean Connery, whereas Timothy Dalton was more the Sean Connery type, but there's nothing wrong with that. Pierce Brosnan really became a popular Bond thanks to this film, and I could see why. I mean, he looks great, and he's awesome in the fight scenes. I have to say, his big mano-a-mano showdown with Sean Bean's Alec Trevelyan at the end of the movie is really cool. You really get the sense that these two former 00 agents are evenly matched. Pierce Brosnan's performance in this gets a 9 on 10. This also has a really good villain. Sean Bean does a great job here as 006, and you know, he probably could have made a perfectly good James Bond himself if the right opportunity had come along. That said, Famke Janssen as Zinnia Onatopp, yes, Onatopp.
Onatopp?
Onatopp.
Really steals the show. I always thought she was one of the best villainesses in the city, and there's this crazy thing where her character orgasms every time she kills that I have to say went way over my head when I saw this as a kid, but now is quite cheeky for a PG-13 movie. Famke looks amazing too, by the way, of course. The villains of this movie are iconic, so I'd give this a 10 on 10.
Why can't you just be a good boy and die?
You first. You second.
Bond girls. Terrific in this movie. Isabella Scrupullo plays Natalia Simonova, who's probably the hottest computer programmer in history. Well, maybe tied with Chris Hemsworth in Black Hat, but I digress. Some of her thunder, though, in this movie is stolen by Jansen, but she's still very sexy and very likable, and probably the best Bond girl of the Brosnan era if you're looking at Bond girls as traditional. I give her about an 8 on 10. Where this movie goes wrong, though, is the musical score. Eric Serra, who's known mostly for his work with Luc Besson, is on hand to provide Bond with a very avant-garde, electronic-influenced score. It's okay, it sounds pretty good, but it sounds like something that's more appropriate for The Professional, the Luc Besson movie that he did before this. And in fact, the soundtrack is very similar, with him even repurposing his big theme song from that film, The Experience of Love, as the closing credits theme on this. It doesn't really fit the movie, and it's notable that they had John Altman come in and rescore the big tank chase through St. Petersburg, because Eric Serra's original track was very strange with like moaning women on the soundtrack. Very bizarre. That said, it has a very good theme song by Tina Turner and The Edge, which in its own way is iconic. I give the music a 7 on 10, but the song is probably a 10 on 10. Here's something very interesting. Bond apparently kills something like 237 people in this outing. Now, I don't really remember the film being particularly violent, but he does blow up not 1 but 2 military bases in the film. So this is probably the highest body count in James Bond history. Pretty crazy.
For England, James? No. For me.
Pierce Brosnan, of course, has some pretty good one-liners. My favorite is probably his introduction where he surprises a Russian soldier using the lavatory systems.
Beg your pardon? Forgot to knock.
There's also a really cool double entendre in the almost love scene with Xenia on a top, where he even mentions safe sex, which is something a lot of people were talking about at that time because, you know, in the Bond movies, he's in and out of bed with ladies and never seems to protect himself.
You don't need the gun, Commander.
That depends on your definition of safe sex.
Interestingly, in terms of James Bond cars, and something that would become very usual for the Pierce Brosnan films, he doesn't drive an Aston Martin, he drives a BMW. It's pretty good looking, and certainly BMW did make a huge impact through these Bond films, but I have to say, I prefer the Aston Martin.
Need I remind you, 007, that you have a license to kill, not to break the traffic laws.
Now, I have to say this movie was a huge worldwide hit, grossing over $350 million worldwide, with it breaking $100 million in the US. This broke franchise records, although adjusted for inflation, it's nowhere near one of the more popular James Bond films. But what was really important was that it showed that contemporary audiences would go see a James Bond movie, and it successfully reinvented the franchise for the 90s. The series was back, and Pierce Brosnan immediately jumped into making another James Bond film, Tomorrow Never Dies, which of course we're going to talk about on the next installment. But here's something really interesting. Goldeneye, as popular as the movie itself is, has a legacy that in some ways has very little to do with the film. You see, when you mention Goldeneye, not everybody just necessarily thinks of the James Bond film. A lot of people think of Goldeneye 007, the N64 game, which I have to say is probably the best first-person shooter video game that we ever got on a console. I remember vividly playing this on N64 at my buddy Danny's house, and we just played this thing over and over and over again. It's one of the best movie tie-in video games of all time, and it's a classic in its own right, as much as the film is. No other video game based on James Bond would ever have even close to that kind of impact, but that didn't stop them from trying, because every time Pierce Brosnan had a James Bond movie come out, they did another video game tie-in, and they almost never worked properly. That said, GoldenEye 007 on N64, it's a classic, and it's surprised that they never really managed to pull off another amazing James Bond video game. Although they did get Sean Connery back to voice James Bond in the From Russia with Love video game, which was quite a coup at the time. Too bad the game itself is only average. And of course, Pierce Brosnan would return in the next James Bond film, but he was about to run into an iceberg at the box office. But of course, that's a story for another day.
Yes! I am invincible!
Thank you for watching James Bond Revisited. If you like what you see, please subscribe to our channel, tell your friends who like this sort of content, and turn on the bell to receive notifications for all of our latest videos. We're an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support.